Thank you very much. So let me start. The book title already says maybe something. The EU Migrant Generation in Asia, Middle Class Aspirations in Asian Global Cities. So my screen is not moving. Okay. What is this a story of? This is a story of young EU citizens who migrate to Asian economic hubs. And I contend that their search for middle-class distinction in the EU of the 2010s has led them to Asia and to very distinct places within. So what I did for this book project is that I studied 70 European migrants in Singapore and in Tokyo over the course of many years, since 2014. And I followed them until the late 2021, so until almost a year ago. And after this time, in general, 6 years, these people have stayed in either of the two cities, Singapore or Tokyo. So there's implications of early career migration on life course at a time of both global mobility and exclusionary systems of migration are something I have found within this group, and which I contend is a phenomenon that is applicable to these two cities, but probably also to other Asian hubs and maybe other economic hubs around the globe. Also, as a second point that I want to make is Singapore and Tokyo as probably or not thoroughly understood migration destinations, how they receive highly educated young professionals, and how their reception of early career migrants has been changing tremendously over the past 10 years. So if we think about Europeans outside their country, what migration literature has mostly talked about, or literature from business and management sector in general, is probably what you could see here on the right-hand side, a typical picture of the European as an expatriate in Asia. Maybe a senior white man in suits on a very privileged position and a good contract that his company has sent him on, and he's supposed to be going back. Other more recent literature then has opened a new field, which is called lifestyle migration, which is usually talking about people who leave in search for a better place of life, the countryside, the sun, retirees, mostly in Southern Europe, but also depicted from Europe to, for example, South America. However, there are newer strands of literature that have demonstrated that Europeans, as well as everyone else in this world, can be migrants in a very different sense. Migrants, for example, in the sense of student migration to other countries, mostly in the EU, for example, in the Erasmus schemes, but also self-initiated intra-European migrants, or sometimes called atypical migrants, as the Eurostars depicted by Favel already in 2008. And then the more critical literature that has come up in the past 10, 15 years that has looked at white people, Europeans, but also Americans, Australians, and so on, in post-colonial places, or here specifically for this research on Asia, that have found how whiteness is often associated with a certain skill or a certain accomplishment, and have started to unsettle this assumption. So this research then is contributing to the recent literature with another new angle, and with looking at a very distinct population of people. So I'm looking at European recent graduates, university graduates, who as self-initiated migrants start their careers full-time in Asian global cities. And with self-initiated, I mean they're not sent by anyone, a company, or on an assignment, but they migrate themselves with their own structures, as I will show. Just as a bit of a background to the context where these people are coming from. The scene is set in the EU of the 2000s that gradually over time enlarged in terms of its member states, coming with also the right to move freely, to reside and work without the need of a visa in the EU free mobility space, as it has been called, and more broadly also in the Schengen area, which includes a few more than the EU member states. And within this territory, the notion of free movement and the notion of the value behind free movement has reached out younger groups of populations, especially students, who made possible by Erasmus and other exchange agreements have continuously and in more long-term movements migrated to other places within the EU, but also beyond, as exchange students, but also as full degree seeking students. And within this set is where the group that I'm looking at has grown up. What I then say about this group is that, first of all, the times at which they grew up, where the EU institutions, scholarship, media has celebrated mobility as something everyone could or should reach. That within this space and within this narrative of the value and the good, the promising aspects behind mobility, mobility has become something that almost came close to a norm for people that they thought if they could not reach this mobility experience, if they couldn't attain the experience of being abroad, speaking other languages, meeting other people, living the cosmopolitan European life, that this was almost something like a lack. So this is the notion of a certain group, of course, of people who have been educated, who have been to university, whose parents have put a lot of value on arts and culture, on languages, on higher education, and on sustaining the middle-class life that their kids have been growing up with. However, there is more to this story, and this generation has not only grown up in a free movement space of more and farther mobilities, but also in a time where, from 9/11 onwards, a set of crises has hit in and has taken the West, if we want, as a larger entity, but also Europe itself as a very vulnerable spot. We have seen certain crises, mostly the Lehman shock and the unfolding economic crisis, but then later also crises of the social institution of the EU, which is probably most well known by the Brexit, the leave of the UK from the EU, that the whole system of this mobility and of this free movement space has been questioned, and also the future of the people living in this space and thinking about their careers and their future. Whereas at the same time, we have seen in Asia, the growth of China, the rise of India, the growth of the Southeast Asian developing countries, the ASEAN countries becoming more prominent, and the dynamics shifting in many ways from the West to other parts of the world, especially Asia. So this generation, and not the whole generation, but within it, the certain fraction of those who have grown up in middle-class households with this notion of mobility, of the values of speaking several languages and so on, with the idea of having been exposed to these mobility experiences in their youth and gradually taking them further and taking the steps being abroad longer. This certain fraction of the millennial generation is the one that I've coined the EU generation. So their challenges of securing employment post-Lehman shock, when it was even for academic educated people extremely difficult to find full-time employment, but also the idea that spatial mobility is something desirable, if not even natural, and definitely advantageous, has shaped how these youth have seen their future and how they have taken mobility decisions one by one. So I argue that the interlocking of two powerful discourses, the EU as a declining entity of multifarious crises, and the celebration and promises of mobility, stirred a general insecurity towards the future of and in the EU, which the EU generation countered by early career migration to rising Asia. And here just one of many statistics that would demonstrate or illustrate better what the situation was about exactly at the time that most of these people graduated and tried to get their first job, was when we can see with the blue line, unemployment rate among young people in the EU was extremely high, especially in the years 2012-13, at the peak of the economic crisis. About a fourth struggled and faced unemployment. if we look at the EU in general, but if we look at countries like Spain, it reached more than 50%. So the data that I gathered for this study comes from a multi-sided ethnography that I was conducting in a longitudinal way from 2014 onwards, first offline in Tokyo, living here and going back and forth to Singapore, later online, keeping in touch with the people after I left the country and other people had moved again. Mostly semi-structured interviews and follow-ups gave me a lot of insight in how these people thought, how they thought about their work experiences, how they considered different options for their mid to long-term future, but also participant observation, ethnographic observations that helped me to understand better also how these people embed in the context of the cities in which they were living. The profile of the group is, as I already mentioned, EU citizens who were between 25 and 35 when I met them the first time, which means that now they have moved on to the next life stage, what I'm going to talk about a lot more. And they encompass various nationalities, 18 altogether, and mostly self-identify and are ascribed as white. They're all tertiary educated and have worked on local contracts with only limited or no work experience at all in Asia at the time I first talked to them. And their migration channels were self-financed, self-initiated. They were local hires, and they fall under the group of the middling migrants. That is also another contribution I will mention later. So what about Asia? What are the Asian errors that drew these people into a new continent and into the difficulties of having to fight for a visa, which they would not need to if they stayed in the EU? A brief overview of Singapore, what it offers, what from the outside it means to people who consider moving to this country. So we had Singapore for a long time as a British colonial state, and after a short transition period as part of Malaysia, it became fully independent in 1965. Thinking about this, when I did this research, the country was just about 50 years old. By then, it had achieved extremely high quality of life. It offered one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. And it was an extremely efficient, comfortable, business-friendly place, as is described by everyone from local people, from migrants who have a voice, from news, from scholarship. The country is one of immigration. So the foreign population in 2020 was more than 1/3 the country. Its population, it was multicultural, and the state adheres to the so-called CMIO principle, which means that the main ethnic groups are Chinese, Malay, and Indian. The O is for others. It is an Asian Pacific business hub with hosting a lot of multinationals. English is one of the 4 official languages, but it is the language for business, which makes it extremely attractive for immigrants. And immigration policies are a different topic. So the country has, since its inceptions, relied on immigrant labor on all ranges of skill levels, from so-called low-skilled labor, mostly in construction, and live-in domestic maids who are highly surveyed and who have very little rights, up to those who are invited to the country, who enjoy a lot of rights, the so-called highly skilled migrants or foreign talents. Scholarship has also argued that the country relies on this bifurcated migration regime with those 2 strands on the top and on the bottom. But as we will see, within that, a lot has happened in recent years. And the country has celebrated its social harmony and social cohesion over decades. But in recent years, up to the point that social unrest and political tensions really hit the country severely, the mood has changed. The government has become much more restrictive in terms of letting in immigrants and issuing visa, because social tensions, both within co-ethnic tensions within ethnic groups, but also against foreigners coming into the country, no matter which skill level, have risen and have made news of xenophobia, and thus kind of damaged the image of Singapore as the ideal migrant state. In comparison to that, we have Tokyo, which is the capital city of Japan, but Japan not being known for being a migrant country. It has had its history of limited engagement for over 200 years. And after the World War II, it was occupied by US forces for some time, which also left an influence of how the country has seen itself, has described itself for long as an ethnically homogeneous country, with the state and authorities being reluctant to officially admit immigration, although in recent years it has become very clear that there are a lot of students, a lot of so-called trainees, and other ethnically Japanese people in the country. So compared to Singapore especially, but also most other kind of immigrant countries, the ratio of foreigners is still very low, but it has risen tremendously in recent 2 decades. One of the important factors about this is that the country used to be the second largest economy in the world until about 13, 14 years ago, when this was then overtaken by China, but still is a very large economy. However, since the burst of its bubble in the early 90s, the gap in society and the replacement of the so-called middle-class society by the gap society has left its scars. And we can see that socially a lot has been changing since then. Foreigners used to be seen as others, and this is one of the few things that hasn't changed much. Within that, if we look at Europeans, or more general people described as white, Debner has argued that these people enjoy, as they used to, still a lot of privileges if we look around and compare to other foreigners, but also that hardly because of these privileges, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to feel accepted and be part of society if they actually want to stay for longer. And so the cosmopolitan white has been one of the others in Japanese society, and this, we will see, hasn't changed that much. What also changed a lot is the expansion of the skilled visa categories that have been added on new categories and have contributed to a more diverse array of people now living in the country, and especially being located in Tokyo, whose sociocultural diversification has really reached rates that make scholars and people around the world quite interested in what is happening here. So just some very, very simple statistics to show that the group that I'm looking at, young EU citizens, their numbers have been rising in the past 15 years, not that significantly, but steadily, except the one drop around the time of the earthquake. And also that they are located mainly in Tokyo, as one could think, almost half of them, as you can see with the second line. And then with a huge gap after, followed by Europeans living in Osaka, Kyoto, and Fukuoka. What I did now, I wanted to understand why people move to Asia. What are their motivations? What are their trajectories? What are the channels they move through? So I created a typology that represents 4 different types of who the first I call the lifestyle seekers, that shows what these people saw in their future destinations. The lifestyle seekers are the ones who said, we wanted to go on a big adventure. And if it doesn't work out, you can always go home. So these people tried something different. They were often moving even as couples. They had an easier way to enter Singapore with the English language and European institutions being all around. And this helped them accessing jobs, though local hired jobs in companies, mostly in Singapore. Career development, as you could think of these quotes, was not the main goal. The goal was to experience a different life, to be exposed to Asia, to the Asian culture, as many said, and to have this as one phase of their life. It was not clear when to return. Some even sold their furniture at home. But the vague idea that they would want to come back to where they came from and just put a hold on that life that their peers at home were doing, building families, building houses. That was the implicit notion behind. The next type then are a quite distinct group who are called the cultural enthusiasts. they were interested very clearly in Japan, not in Asia, but in Japan, in the Japanese language and the Japanese culture, which also meant they started early. They invested in the language because they were interested, but also the more they knew about the country, they understood that without the language, they wouldn't know much about the country, they wouldn't be able to spend any time there. So this Northern European woman, put it simply, she wanted to get better at the Japanese language and didn't want to do it just as a hobby, shumiteki. So I decided to enter university and study Japan studies, as a semonka, as a professional. So this was her goal, and she did everything to make it happen. She moved alone at a very early age as an exchange student, and then once in Japan, followed her Japanese peers, did the job hunting process, the institutionalized process of getting into a job as a fresh graduate in Japan, and she started working in a huge Japanese corporation. So what these people's goal is not about the job per se, but it is about life in Japan. And this is only possible with a visa and thus with a job. Next are the global professionals, as I call them, who really look after that international, that cosmopolitan environment where they feel they can unfold much better, they have better opportunities, they have more interesting chances in life, both for terms of work, but also for their social life. So this French Arabic woman, she was a lawyer in France, but she said that your prospects international-wise are limited. And I wanted to have a more international career. When you arrive here in Singapore, which you moved to, when you cross the border, people will never look at you like, oh, we don't need you, or something like that. They give you a chance to succeed. And this was what she really put into contrast to her home country, France, that she called a very elitist place, but also to Europe more in general, that is not known as being all too welcoming and friendly to foreign migrants. So again, this is a highly diverse group. A lot of women who move alone, people with migrant background who have never really felt at home in Europe, people who are gay, not only people who didn't see Europe as their home, but in general, people who longed for something as they felt would be more dynamic, more international, more cosmopolitan. They often don't stay at that one place. So in her case, she also changed cities. And we see a lot of remigration within the Asian Pacific business hubs where these people see networks, job opportunities, and so on. And as a last one, the so-called precarious movers. And here, as a disclaimer, this is a minority in the group. It's just 10% of those that I followed, but they are significant because they really represent what was the worst case that could happen in the EU of the 2010s. So the quote I wrote here is from a Portuguese man who moved to Singapore, because at the time that after being abroad in Asia for a few times, he came back and wanted to find a job in his home country, there was none. It was a bad time in Europe and the world and for an architect. So I was applying for all kinds of jobs. And I was a little bit desperate because at that time I was waking up and still living with my mom. Your self-esteem goes down, you start questioning yourself. So they literally flew the crisis. These people came mostly from Southern European countries, but also from some Eastern European and Northern European countries at the fringes of the European Union. Their precarious migration channels meant that they usually just entered a country, more often Singapore than Japan, without a visa, which gave them exactly 3 months as an EU citizen to find a job. Otherwise, they would have to leave. So there we could see a lot of back and forth, but some made it. Of course, the self-selected group that I'm talking about are the ones who made it and found a job. Then important is that these people would not have had no job at home. I mean, in this example, you could see the household situation was well enough that this person could have stayed at home for some time at least. He also found other jobs before he decided to leave, but there is something more about it. What he found in Singapore was a job in his field, in architecture, where he had a high quality of life, where he was independent. And this pride and this class consciousness is something that runs as a line through all of these types and their motivations and investment and efforts in making it to Asia, but also in staying there. So because I don't have time to explain their whole labor market integration, but it would of course be a very interesting issue that I've studied long, I summarize in a very brief way and go just afterwards in some of these details. So what we can see with Singapore and Tokyo as destinations is that the access to employment in Singapore was mostly European institutions or European corporations based. In Tokyo, we see a whole different picture, which is the one to make it into the Japanese labor market, to start right from zero, together with Japanese peers right from graduating from university. This is how people often came into their jobs, were trained on the job with entry-level jobs, which means relatively low salary as well. In terms of industry, this group represents quite well the industries that are strong in both countries, with Singapore being mostly about logistics, IT, architecture, consulting, financial services. In Japan, we see a lot of manufacturing, but also in the big conglomerates where people move kind of within industry, within one big firm, but also fashion, IT, but then also something more distinct about Japan, translation, some cultural activities, and renewable energies. In terms of the employment conditions, the ones in Singapore are often in multinational firms, in the regional headquarters there. And this also means that their job really includes a lot of working together with other subsidies, with clients overseas. Whereas in Japan, we see that a lot is very domestic. People enter often Japanese companies if they can, because this is what gives them the say-shine position, the permanent employment that almost everyone tries to obtain in Japan. A few, however, don't have the language skills or don't want to and consciously apply for foreign firms where they work on 2- or 3-year contract jobs. In terms of the characteristics of the incorporation labor market, Singapore is all about transients. And this is tied to the legal position these people have and the visa system. So the visas get extremely difficult over time to get renewed. People need to have higher salaries. They need to show some new skill acquisition, and companies have to show that they can really not find any local person to employ. So over the years that I followed these people, even the ones who were quite accomplished, struggled more and more to get their visa renewed. Others were not able to enter anymore. And others who tried to get permanent residency, which the country provided to a lot of highly skilled migrants in the 2000s, were not able to get permanent residency, although they might have stayed 8 or 10 years in the country. The other way around, in Tokyo, you can see people struggling a lot in the beginning, where language issues are a huge factor. The tacit rules in business, the tokenism that some of them have experienced as a foreigner, a visible foreigner, in a firm that almost doesn't employ other foreigners, or where most of the foreigners would be people from East Asian countries who don't face the difficulty with the written language. But then over time, and with often being unsatisfied and changing jobs again and again and again, which is of course very constraining, these people slowly made their way into the Japanese labor market. They knew over time they would be able to find a new job. They would be hired and they would have enough of a salary and a decent life so that it was worth it. So their profile became more adapted to the Japanese labor market over time, although often in foreign firms and not in Japanese ones where they started out. Oh, sorry. And the last one point, which is of course important, is the gender dynamics at play in both countries. Interestingly, for women in Singapore, quite a few said they felt they had more chances in the Singaporean labor market than at home in Europe. They felt it was more progressive. If you had the skills, you were given a chance. And we can remember the earlier quote. That, however, changed at the point of time when they started to think about families and realized that their professional position would not be flexible in any way if they wanted to go home earlier, wanted to avoid business trips, and so on and so on. And this is where people dropped out or left the country. In Tokyo, women from the very beginning on were very skeptical about their reception as a foreign woman, being almost doubly disadvantaged, as they felt, in the Japanese labor market, in the more general context of high gender inequality, that is quite well known, and even more if they thought about the incompatibility of work and family life. And after the whole period of surveying these people, we have 15 of 70 who have children at the age of nowadays between 35 and early 40s. So maybe a fifth, which is not very much if you think about that age. And the other interesting point here is that still more than half of them are still in these two countries. So this is maybe something I will come back to, but let's quickly look just at one point that relates to the labor market integration. And I have two cases. One is that of a French woman in Singapore, and her trajectory was one that started with her first job in Shanghai, where she moved to as a graduate, worked herself through a few small companies, and at some point got a job offer from a Taiwanese firm, and the job would be in Singapore. So for her, the question was, should she continue with, she said, crappy small jobs of companies that fail in Shanghai, or should she take a job that she was selected for because she knew a little bit of Chinese, not really fluent, but something. She represented Europe, or largely the West, for the Taiwanese firm that wanted to do business with Europe. And she was not very senior, so the salary wasn't too high, but she was able to move immediately to Singapore. And this is what she did. So this gave her a management position after just a few years in work experience, and also meant that she moved to Singapore. Using this capital that she had, first of all, the symbolic and cultural capital of different languages and of her degree from a European institution, but then also using kind of her social capital because she was in a community of French people in Shanghai, some of who had earlier moved to Singapore. And it was kind of, for her, a reassurance that she would have something to start with in Singapore if she moved. And so it was quite a strategic move to, first of all, have a job, have a kind of career progression that would probably not have unfolded in Shanghai, but also to be able to actually exercise the move, feeling safe, having something to start with in Singapore. And later on, she became more strategic when she started thinking about family plans and moved again to within Singapore to a European firm that she hoped would help her to return to Singapore when she wanted to have children. So in her case, that couple actually returned to Europe, though, and this again is important, not to France, to London, to another global city where they found attractive jobs based on what they had, the skills they had accumulated, the experiences in different countries, working with different firms and clients that helped them to access jobs in London. The other example from Tokyo is that of a Greek man who entered after graduation from a Tokyo University, a French firm in Japan in financial services, who still, after 6 or 7 years in the labor market, says that Japan, and here I quote, is still a land of opportunities for everyone who speaks several languages. You might not be the best one in your field, you might not get the highest salary, but you can lead a decent life if you just know how to use what is seen as attractive. Your university degree, both from Europe and then later from Tokyo, your language skills, and your slow understanding of the business culture, which in his case was further nurtured by being married to a Japanese woman. And his way into the labor market and his deepening embedding has also led to his permanent residency nowadays and to buying an apartment. So this couple is one that's probably going to stay. So what we can see here is that what these European young professionals are using is something that has been called by Morede mobility capital. And I argue that it helps enhance the conversion potential of the social and cultural capital of these European youth, whose economic capital is rather limited. Accrued through accumulated mobility experiences, it helps migrants navigate the migration process, and it is symbolic too in the way it confers competence and recognition by prospective employers and thus facilitates employment in a transnational field. And the transnational aspect we could probably see a lot in the Singaporean case, whereas in the Japan case, the trajectories are quite different. And making sense of these different trajectories is where the last part that probably is missing from the picture is hitting in. And this is intimacy and emplacement in the countries of in their destination countries. So as mentioned earlier, in Singapore, which is an immigrant country with a third of the population being foreigners themselves, these Europeans socialize in very international networks. That might be in the case of those with larger numbers of representation in the country, for example, French, that might be very ethnic French networks, but in the case of most, it is international, very global in every sense, including Singaporeans who have worked abroad or who have interest in being surrounded by these international people. And this helps the transnational movements that these people are exercising over time. So many have moved within Asia from different global cities to another one. And some have returned to Europe, usually to a place like London, sometimes to Brussels, Amsterdam, anything that kind of still allows them to lead the global lifestyle and to make use of their professional experiences in terms of the firms, the scope and scale of the work they have. In Tokyo, what we can see is a huge ambivalence. People have invested. They came to the country at a very young age. They have put a lot of effort into studying the language and into trying to adapt to the labor market. And just leaving that behind for them seems like a waste. On the other hand, they get very skeptical about their future. The more they integrate into the labor market in Japan, the less their profile seems to be attractive, especially for their home country, if not maybe in a Japanese firm in their home country. What they lack is any networks at home. Most of them have never worked at home, and they have spent their 20s, maybe even their 30s abroad. So there's at one point the perceived need to be actually able to move back and maybe to also be closer to family. But then on the other hand, there's this wish to make use of all they have invested and to stay and to be accepted and to belong. So what we can see is both for those who stay and for those who move on, that they always weigh their options. The staying, but also the moving on is a conscious practice. It is agency that they have largely, although of course several structures, and I will point out again which ones there are sometimes holding them back or not allowing them to stay. So the onwards migration is often for career development. Staying is first about the wish to embed in the country and become part of society. Over the years, migrants understand they will never be really part of the society, of Japanese society or Singaporean society, which itself is fragmented, where foreigners are still often seen as outsiders, or where, in the case of Singapore, they just don't have any legal status that allows them to stay for many years. But what they feel is the more they have become acquainted with the place they are in, they feel comfortable and they are familiar with their neighborhoods and have some very close networks. This is enough, and it still guarantees them to lead a good life in the place where they are. And still a few return, and this is often about family considerations. Parents are aging, but also the idea of raising kids in the EU, where social services are very different than in Asia, where of course families are close by and might be able to support them. So to almost finish, I just show a few of the different constellations of intimacy and romantic relationships and how they impact what people are deciding for their trajectories. So one is a French man I call Casper, who is in IT and who moved to Singapore in 2012. He was already married, but he wanted to have an MBA in Asia, which he saw as the growing and dynamic region at the time. So his wife follows 2 years later, and both of them develop independently their own careers, but with a lot of turnovers and job changes. So in Casper's case, he started out at local firms, usually Chinese run, where he felt that although Singapore is an English place, Chinese is the minority, the majority in the country. And not speaking Chinese was sometimes a disadvantage, even in his position in the company. So he worked himself through different firms, trying startups as well, while his wife was employed in a huge health firm, and thus allowed him to, at times, even be out of a work visa because he was a dependent of his wife and could try his entrepreneurial ideas. What the couple tried is to get permanent residency. They applied first. He did, rejected. She did, rejected. And so they started to think about their future. But then thinking back and looking back at Europe at this time, around 2015, 2017, in 2015, the refugee crisis, the Brexit to come, they didn't feel Europe would be the place to be for the years to come. So despite that crisis, despite their road to PR being permanent residency seemingly being closed, they stayed on. They stayed on, and they were able to do so because they saw their relationship as an enabler of their staying. If one person, and this happened later, his wife got fired, was out of a job, the other one would sponsor the visa. So like this, they have been living in Singapore for many years. They have swapped the role of the lead migrant and the follow migrant, and they have started to navigate and challenge the constraining migration policies in Singapore. The situation looks very different for those who don't come from the same country and who don't move together. And there we have both people who are in long-term relationships or marry locals, so Singaporeans or Japanese, but also those who find a partner who again comes from a different country, a third country national, as I call them. So the quote I have here is that of a French woman who said, "In our case, I think if I was not with him, my husband, I would be back to France already. I'm always a little bit tired of Japanese society. In our case, we are kind of stuck in Japan because it's the only place where we can both find work." So her husband is Korean, and he has been in the country even longer than her. And she was one of the cultural enthusiasts who studied the language, who tried everything to feel part and have a job in the country, and who felt it was very difficult, as a lot of other people said, to make friends, to really feel accepted, and who was thinking about returning to her home place a lot of times. But the relationship grew stronger, they married. And in the end, Japan is the country where both have the skills that they can do professional work. So there is not really any question. The problem, of course, is that both are on work visa. There is not really any security. At some point, her husband got permanent residency, which changed the picture. But in general, these couples, they try to accumulate as many skills that make them employable either in the country of choice in which they are at this moment, or more often in the transnational field. Jobs that make them, or skills that make them employable around the world. And this explains a lot why people are moving between Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, and London. And this is a lot the case for those who come, for example, both from European countries, but not from the same. So in Singapore, there were people from Southern European countries, but different ones. If they thought about return, where should they return to? The economy at home was not doing very well. Brexit made the UK a big question mark for a lot of people. Other countries that were doing economically quite well, like Germany, have the high wall of the German language. So where to? As long as they can, they stay, or they move to a different Asian or maybe completely different city. Religious issues sometimes also are a factor. And in general, Asian European marriages make people often stay in place. The Asian partner's family is close by, especially if they talk about children, that would be a place to be. But then also, for example, a Muslim partner in Singapore makes it very difficult for the couple to think about moving to Europe. So, because not everyone is in a relationship, I'd like to end with those whose careers usually push them to move on and on if they didn't feel there was this one significant other who influenced their decision of where to stay or where to go. And this woman, I talked to her when she had returned to Europe, but not to her home country, which is Italy, but as a mathematics major, and having been during her studies in Germany and France, she started working in France and then at some point moved internally, but on a local contract, to Tokyo. And after a few years in Tokyo and a lot of struggling, she returned to France, so not her home country, and we talked online. And her reflection about the work experience, I think, drives home the point about the distinction and the kind of life, middle-class life, but very far from Europe, that these people feel they can grab if they just make it to one of these cities. I felt more professional and advanced in my position in Tokyo. I felt that I was more special there than now, having experienced something that not everybody has achieved, statistically speaking. Whereas in Paris, there are plenty of Italian, Spanish, etc. It's less challenging to think about. Whereas living in Japan, maybe when being there, it was kind of a proof to myself. I managed something, not great, but important. It was good for me. So those who were not in a relationship, they were more easily to move on and try a new place. But usually they would try not to return to their home country. Family considerations, as said before, and here definitely gender made a huge difference, because in terms of the women, you can see more often how they move closer back to their home countries, move closer back to their families, and this is very much also related to the wish to have children. As a conclusion, Singapore and Tokyo is early career destinations. What this is about is not about a migration to Japan, but one to Tokyo. It is not a migration about Singapore, but to a Southeast Asia-Pacific hub. It is about the high quality of life that these cities promise to people, and it is about the cosmopolitan environment they expect to enjoy there. Interesting, though, is that Singapore is the ideal immigrant country in Asia, has changed very much in the way it receives and allows people to see a future in the country. Whereas Japan, that is usually seen as the non-immigrant country, the one where just no one can feel at home. And although most of these people say they do not feel at home in Japanese society, the country has achieved of actually retaining people and making them feel secure in Japan. So these people fill middling positions in the labor market and in society, which is very much characterized by job change, changing again, often within a place, just to be able to stay in that place. However, gender is a huge factor. The inflexible working conditions, they obstruct family plans, which explains why there are so few people who actually dare having family in Asia, but they would rather return or postpone having children, because many of these women also live with this idea of having moved independently and being independent, and they want to stay independent and see that if they had children, they would probably be the one who had to drop out of the labor market. So against all odds, the majority has stayed so far. And especially in international marriages, these two destinations have become long-term places of living. And what we could see is that this certain life stage that these people moved, that was very young, that they were not able to build networks and professional qualifications in Europe, but did the very same in Asia, really made them stay on a longer term and helped them to achieve something that in many ways their peers at home in Europe achieved as well. And the longer they stayed, path dependency hit in and makes it difficult to return as well. However, again, the gendered onwards migration trajectories show quite a difference in terms of those having kids, where the European men with Asian women would stay more often in Asia, whereas the other way around, people might move back, which is actually the case for 2 women married to Asian men who brought them, pushed them back to Europe. This is it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Helena. I think we can stop sharing right now and we can take some questions.